if Ahsoka never left the Jedi Order? In the main story, Ahsoka relinquished her position in the Jedi Order after she was falsely accused of a major crime and nobody backed her up. Over in the Bantha Stew Discord, however, Acceleration asked what would have happened if instead Ahsoka had stuck around. That's the story we'll be exploring today, so let's dive right into things. Our story begins following the sham trial of Ahsoka Tano for the bombing of the Jedi Temple. When the Jedi extend to her the offer to stay and to be giving her old position back, Ahsoka initially refuses, just like she did in the show. However, after further considering the implications of leaving, Ahsoka believes that she could better make changes to the Jedi Order from within, rather than simply by leaving. So she agrees to stay, provided that she's able to follow her own path and not be governed by the every whim of the Council. While initially the more stoic and dogmatic members of the Jedi Council grumble about this, they are eventually persuaded by Obi-Wan, Plo Koon, and Yoda to allow Ahsoka to become a way-seeker within the Jedi Order and discover her own path. This is a concept that pops up in the Old Republic for Jedi who are not under the will of the Council, but rather trying to discover their place in the Force. They also say that her numerous encounters with the Separatists during the war, along with her false trial, both counted as unusual circumstances for her Padawan trials, and they promote her to the rank of Jedi Knight, cutting off her Padawan braid. How does this decision impact the rest of our story? There's some unexpected twists to this story, so let's dive right in and find out. When Anakin hears of Ahsoka's decision to remain a Jedi Knight and remain in the Jedi Order, he's elated. He gives her a holocall expressing how proud he is of her and how far she's come, telling her that he never doubted for a moment that she was innocent. In this moment, Ahsoka confides in Anakin about her doubts in the Jedi, saying that while Anakin had fought for her innocence, there had been masters whom she'd trusted for her entire life that had thrown her under the bus and hadn't stuck up for her, just because they wanted to play politics with the Republic. Anakin expresses that he always had similar concerns and frustrations, but that he still believed the Order as a whole stood for the good of the galaxy. Ahsoka admitted that she wasn't so certain anymore, especially after seeing the political corruption that existed within the Republic's borders in her experiences with Padme, and also seeing that there were other things wrong on worlds that were not members of the Republic, which the Republic refused to help with, like with the corruption on Mandalore. Ahsoka tells Anakin that she's been permitted to become a way-seeker and operate independent of the Council and of the war movement while she found her own purpose. She tells Anakin that she will be leaving shortly, and when her master asks where she'll be going, she tells him that it will be wherever the Force tells her to. Before wishing his former Padawan well on her endeavors, Anakin tells her that if she ever needs him, he'll be there for her. Ahsoka says that she knows before turning off the call. Following Ahsoka's departure from the temple, which takes place shortly after her chat with Anakin, events transpire in a similar fashion to how they go down in the Clone Wars. Palpatine consolidates power over the Banks, the Fives conspiracy takes place, Yoda goes on his mission of Force discovery, and Jar Jar still goes on his mission with Mace Windu where he met his girlfriend. Gosh, I still can't believe that Jar Jar has a girlfriend and I don't. Maybe part of that is the fact that I sit and write Star Wars videos in my spare time. Anyway, moving on. While all of this is taking place, Ahsoka moves across the galaxy, helping the people that she sees are in need. She follows her own path, and she continues to keep in touch with those in the Order that are important to her. She talks with Anakin frequently, detailing how she believes that the Jedi should be on these planets helping the people who are hurting, rather than commanding on the battlefields. Obi-Wan also touches base with her, monitoring what she's up to for the Council, but not interfering. Occasionally, the two of them butt heads over how Ahsoka handles certain situations, but in the end, Obi-Wan knows better than to impose on the young Jedi. Padme also frequently speaks with Ahsoka, knowing that she's doing good work for the Republic. However, Ahsoka goes beyond the confines of helping people within the Republic borders. She causes some waves and gains notoriety throughout the galaxy for also going into separatist and neutral systems to provide their citizens with any aid that they require, making the statement that the Jedi should reach beyond politics and work for the betterment of the galaxy as a whole. Separatists applaud her for her actions, as do the neutral worlds, and use her as political propaganda to illustrate the corruption of the Jedi Order. Senators within the Republic end up fussing about her in their hearings, claiming that Ahsoka is a separatist and should be further sanctioned by the Order, who was serving the interests of the Republic in this war. Ahsoka denies any claims of making political statements. Rather, she tells the media that she's just doing her duty as a Jedi to the greater galaxy. She even states in many interviews that as a way-seeker, she doesn't abide by the will of the Council. Instead, she's on her own journey of personal self-discovery. For Ahsoka, this wasn't about politics. Instead, it was about her own journey of religious self-fulfillment. The Council, however, didn't seem to see things in the same way. They beg Ahsoka multiple times to stay within Republic boundaries, citing that it isn't safe for Jedi to be poking around inside of Separatist space, especially since Dooku is a Sith Lord behind the scenes. Ahsoka argues that in her experience, many of the Separatist citizens have welcomed her and expressed their frustration with many of the Jedi, who claim to be for the entire galaxy, yet refuse to listen to the concerns of people outside of the Republic. While some Separatist leaders have tried to detain her, she's always able to escape safely from their grasp. In this timeline, Ahsoka does never meet Trace and Rafa Martez on Coruscant. Instead, she learns of the plights of the greater galaxy on her journey as a Wayseeker. Therefore, because of this, she never learns of Maul's actions on Mandalore, and she doesn't end up going there to lead the siege. Instead, she continues to give small-scale aid on a variety of different worlds. Eventually, however, Ahsoka's luck runs out. While she's poking around in Separatist space, Ahsoka ends up running into trouble on Raxus, the capital city of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. Due to its status as the central world of the Confederacy, it is heavily protected. And although Ahsoka is acting out of a non-partisan agenda, she is still a Jedi. One night, as Ahsoka stealthily moves through the streets of Raxus, she's spotted by a team of commando droids patrolling the city. Because Ahsoka has her hood up, they think that she's up to something suspicious. So they ask that she provide identification and insight as to where she's going. Ahsoka attempts to reason with them, telling the droids that she forgot her identification at home, and was just out for a nighttime stroll. Because Ahsoka is a high-profile figure throughout the galaxy, though, the droids recognize her voice from some HoloNet footage that they had been exposed to, registering that she is Ahsoka Tano, Jedi Knight. While a B1 and B2 wouldn't be able to do this, these commando droids are much more specialized and far more competent. Ahsoka uses the Force to initially escape the droids, but they call for backup. Eventually, Ahsoka is being pursued by an entire contingent of battle droids firing in her direction. At first, she's able to escape them. She runs through the alleys of Raxus, outwitting the dumb B1s and B2s at every turn. Eventually, however, more of the deadly commando droids find her, and they end up firing stun blasts in her direction. Because Ahsoka trained with Rex and the 501st to block these blasts during Tales of the Jedi, Ahsoka is able to fend for herself for many minutes. Eventually, however, the sheer number of droids overwhelms her, and with no clones or other Jedi to help her out, she falls prey to the stun blasts. The droids handcuff her and throw her in one of the Separatist jails on Raxus. The next day, word of Ahsoka's arrest gets out to the general public. Protests break out across the Confederacy and within the Republic from people who believe that Ahsoka is doing what is best for the galaxy as a whole. Because of Ahsoka's peaceful mission, however, none of them become violent to represent her cause. Even representatives from both governments recognize that this holding is unjust due to her non-partisan actions, and therefore she must be released. However, Republic nationalists twist this into tricking the galaxy into believing that the Separatists are corrupt and never to be trusted in any circumstance, despite the fact that earlier they had been railing against Ahsoka Tano's involvement with the Separatists. Politicians, especially in the Star Wars galaxy. Some Separatist parliamentarians argue that this detainment is unfortunate, but that Ahsoka is no different from any other Jedi due to her association with an order that works in cahoots with a corrupt government. For a few days, Ahsoka merely sits in her cell, meditating. Upon hearing this, Anakin is incredibly frustrated. He goes to the Jedi Council and demands that they do something to help his former Padawan. They tell Anakin that unfortunately, because she was poking around in Separatist space without their permission, there was nothing that they could do. Anakin shouts expletives at them, telling them that they're just leaving her out to dry again, just like they did during the trial that she'd been found innocent in. He storms out of the council chambers, refusing to take no for an answer. He contacts Rex and asks him if he'd be interested in going on an unsanctioned mission. Rex says that the Republic would definitely notice his absence, as the 501st was a pretty high-profile legion, but that he could poke around with some lesser-known friends and see if he could find anyone willing to help. Within a couple of hours, Anakin receives an encrypted communication from someone on his holo tablet that reads, "Meet us tonight behind 79's Hunter." So Anakin prepares to sneak out and meet his new allies. Before Anakin leaves, Obi-Wan confronts him in his room. Kenobi knows that his former Padawan is trying to go after Ahsoka, just because of past patterns, and he tells Anakin to try not to do anything rash. Anakin tells him that there's nothing rash about wanting to help a friend, and he tells Obi-Wan that he can't let the council leave Ahsoka out to dry again. At this, Obi-Wan leaves, wishing Anakin the best of luck, but advising against this course of action. Anakin descends into the lower levels of Coruscant, diving into the underbelly of the city. As he moves towards 79's, Anakin sees more of what Ahsoka means about how the people of the galaxy were suffering. There's so much poverty that existed quite literally right below the noses of the Jedi, and they're doing absolutely nothing to help these folks. It fills Anakin with somewhat of a righteous rage, stoking his continued agitation with the Jedi Council. When he finally reaches 79's, he's met with two very distinct-looking groups of clones in civilian clothes. One is the Bad Batch, who Anakin had not yet met, as this is taking place right before the events of Skako Minor that kicked off Season 7 in the Clone Wars, and the small section of clone commandos that we know as Delta Squad. Each group briefly introduces themselves to Anakin. Anakin asks if they were willing to undergo this mission to help free Ahsoka, despite not being formally sanctioned by the Republic. Hunter tells Anakin that they don't officially report to anyone, so no harm, no foul. Boss tells Anakin that Delta is always down for a little bit of fun, and that oftentimes special operations engages in missions that most of the government doesn't know about anyways. Perhaps this was even one of them. Anakin's pleased by this response and lets them know that he'll take full blame if they're caught. The clones agree to these terms and they're ready to go. Anakin relays them his plan, and the group nods along, ready to take up this challenge. It was time for Anakin to rescue his former Padawan. The small contingent takes the Bad Batch's ship, the Marauder, to Raxus. The Bad Batch lets Anakin know that they've been given separatist clearance codes by Rex, who asks some favors from a few of his friends within the intelligence division. That's also how they know where exactly Ahsoka is being held. The group puts on civilian clothing before docking on Raxus, intending to stealthily make their way through the city towards the prison. Anakin notices that something feels slightly off with his force sensation, but he doesn't think too much of it. He can still use his abilities, but things feel cloudy. Perhaps that was just a fog that the Council had been since the beginning of the Clone Wars, and maybe it was starting to finally rub off on him. Using the expertise of Tech and Fixer, the group manages to bypass the prison's camera system, putting them each on repeated loops of their respective monitored areas so that they can move through the hallways undetected. Hey folks, if you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications as we update this channel weekly with new What If content. Now, back to the story. Then, Wrecker and Scorch create a small demolition, to the immense sadness of Wrecker, who wanted something bigger, that allowed them to break into one of the back doors of the prison. Wrecker is sad that the boom isn't massive like what he's used to, but he still goes along with the plan. 7 Crosshairs stand on guard, waiting to snipe any possible droids that are there to make trouble for them. Hunter, Boss, and Anakin take the lead, moving stealthily through the prison until eventually they come to the door that Tech identifies to belong to Ahsoka's prison cell. 7 Crosshairs snipe the 2 commando droids that stand sentry from a nearby vantage point, and Tech manages to open the door. The contingent wasn't expecting to see what was in the cell. Standing before them was Count Dooku himself, speaking directly to Ahsoka. Anakin's jaw drops to the floor, as does Ahsoka's. However, the Count greets Skywalker with his back still turned towards him, saying that he could sense him from the moment that he arrived on Raxus. He said that he'd been purposefully clouding his senses and force abilities so that he wouldn't be detectable, and so that Ahsoka wouldn't be able to sense the presence of her friend nearby. Finally, Dooku turns towards Anakin and beckons him to take a seat. The clones raise their weapons, and Dooku says that there would be no need for that, before flicking his finger and disarming them, pulling the weapons towards where he was sitting. This takes the group of clones off guard, and they look taken aback. Dooku then asks Anakin if once again he was disobeying the Council's orders, as his contacts in the Republic government hadn't heard about this mission. Anakin doesn't respond, and Dooku tells him that no response tells him all that he needs to know. Once again, Dooku spouts his reasons for politics and how the Republic is corrupt, how the Confederacy of Independent Systems needed to be allowed sovereignty. He then tells Anakin that he was just chatting with Ahsoka about how they'd both seen the corruption of the Jedi Council seeping into galactic affairs, but how she somehow still believes that overall they are a good order, much because of Anakin's teachings. Dooku praises how astute she is, especially for a Jedi as young as herself. He then says that he visited Ahsoka as soon as he heard of her capture because he wanted to chat with her and thought that perhaps she could be swayed into the separatist cause. Anakin looks at Ahsoka, telling her not to believe anything that this liar has to say. He's a Sith, after all. Dooku laughs, taunting Anakin by asking who he thinks the Jedi were actually slaves to. He pulls the same trick that he did with Obi-Wan in Attack of the Clones, telling Anakin that the Republic was secretly controlled by a man that called himself Darth Sidious. Anakin, naturally, doesn't believe him. However, Dooku says that he has proof, and that together the three of them could band together and save the galaxy from Sidious's oppression. Anakin pauses for a moment, considering this. Wrecker and Hunter tell Anakin that this is all a load of garbage, and that Dooku is feeding them nasty stuff to try and solidify his influence over the two Jedi. Ahsoka tells Anakin that she can't sense any deception in Dooku during the moment, but, as stated earlier, Dooku had been clouding their perception of the Force. Anakin shakes his head, not convinced. He tells Dooku that he'll never join him, and that his allegiance is always to the Republic. Dooku smirks, saying that it's a pity, and that one day the galaxy would see that he was correct. The Sith Lord ignites his curved, hilted saber, pointing it at Anakin, challenging him to a duel. Anakin responds, clicking his lightsaber into action as well. The two begin to fight. Ahsoka merely watches, her sabers having been taken earlier by the droid guards. As the battle is taking place, new security droids come to replace the sentries that had fallen prey to the clones earlier. It's a team of clone commandos that have been sent to counter the elite group of clones. Without their weapons, the clones had to resort to hand-to-hand combat, which Wrecker doesn't mind. Hunter's knife is still in his concealed sheath, so he pulls it out and begins slicing the commando droids. The others attempt to grab their weapons from Dooku, as he's now distracted in the battle with Anakin, but he senses this and continues to move them out of their way using the Force with his free hand. The clones look silly as they try to grab their weapons, but Hunter and Wrecker manage to combat the droids quite well on their own, at least initially. As more come to deal with them, the clones begin to get overwhelmed, and they take cover inside the cell. Ahsoka, noticing their struggle, uses the Force to push their weapons toward them, and the clone gang is finally able to grab their guns. Anakin and Dooku continue to dance with their lightsabers, and Dooku goads Anakin into using his darker emotions against him. Anakin obliges, tapping into his anger to produce heavier and heavier strikes against the aging Sith. While Dooku's dueling prowess is galaxy-renowned, the youthful strength of Anakin begins to overpower him. In the contained space, Anakin forces Dooku to parry many strikes and eventually pushes him into a corner. At this point, Anakin begins to rain down fury on the Sith, finally knocking the lightsaber from Dooku's hands. Anakin remarks about how Dooku had lost. Dooku puts his hands up in surrender. Without Palpatine being around to convince Anakin to kill Dooku in this situation, he instead points the lightsaber towards Dooku's throat and demands that he call off the droids and allow their contingent to leave peacefully with Ahsoka. Dooku ends up seeing that he has no other alternative, and he allows for the contingent to leave, calling off the droids that were still battling Delta Squad and the Bad Batch. Anakin then says that he doesn't trust Dooku, and he asks that Dooku escort them back to where they came from. Dooku obliges, and he takes the Jedi and the clones along to their return to the Marauder, and Anakin's saber is still pressed to his neck. Dooku even stops by the prison gate and requests that they give Ahsoka back her lightsabers due to the diplomatic negotiations with Anakin Skywalker, in the words of Padme Amidala. The Bad Batch and Delta remain vigilant, staying alert as Dooku takes them through the compound, ensuring that none of the droids act up and begin attacking them. After a few tense minutes, the group makes it to the Marauder. Being the classy gentleman that he is, Dooku holds his end of the bargain and allows for the group to depart. However, before they leave, Dooku reminds the two Jedi to keep what he had told them in mind. As the Marauder departs Raxus, piloted by Tech, Anakin and Ahsoka decide that upon arrival on Coruscant, they will recount their story to the Council. When Anakin, Ahsoka, and the clones return to Coruscant, they're met with mixed reactions. At first, they're able to sneak around stealthily. The clones went back to their normal duties, keeping their involvement quite hushed, as usual. Republic intelligence does their best to keep the involvement of these more specialized groups on the down low due to the nature of their work. When the pair of Jedi return to the temple, Anakin is praised by many for the daring rescue of his former Padawan, who was a hero of the needy, but he is also heavily bashed by the Council and Republic military leadership. After all, he had acted against orders. He had proved that the Jedi had become too high and mighty on their military power. To these claims, Anakin argues that he only had done his duty as a Jedi. Ahsoka backs up her master publicly, stating that Anakin had acted as a real Jedi should, helping somebody who had required assistance. Anakin is absolutely flamed by the Jedi Council, who have become increasingly frustrated with his unorthodox command style and way of conduct. They remove him of his command position, putting him on probation within the Jedi archives. Anakin is once again upset. He'd done something good for the Republic and the galaxy at large, yet he was being punished? Obi-Wan tries to console him, saying that initially they were planning on kicking him out of the Order entirely, but Obi-Wan talked them down. Anakin is still incredibly frustrated by the ruling, but he calms down a little bit. He tells Obi-Wan that Dooku had told him about the Sith, which matched with the story that Obi-Wan had been told on Geonosis. Obi-Wan states that while he believes Dooku is a master manipulator, he also knows that there is a significant amount of corruption within the Republic, which he has been witness to on multiple occasions. Later, when Ahsoka and Anakin testify before the Council about their experience on Raxus, they spill the same story. The Jedi are concerned by this development, but they merely say that they will remain vigilant and keep watching. Ahsoka remarks that they've been blindly following for years, and that their duty as Jedi is to further investigate this corruption for the greater good of the galaxy, rather than just playing politics. The Jedi dismiss her view, saying that their duty was to the Republic. Ahsoka remarks that perhaps their duty should instead be to the citizens of the government, rather than its corporate leaders. Later, when Anakin and Padme are alone, he tells her about what he's been thinking about lately. She remarks that she agrees with much of it, especially the corruption in the Senate. While she was by no means a separatist, she believed that Palpatine's consolidation of more and more power throughout the war had been an incredibly concerning development. She also knew that there was significant corruption within the Senate, as a senator herself. So, she tells Anakin that in the hearing the next day, she would be certain to act. When Padme hits the Senate floor the next day, she proposes something that nobody is expecting. Padme proposes a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Palpatine, the same fate that he had orchestrated for his predecessor, Valorum. She says that the corruption in the Senate has gone too far, and that it seemed like nobody cared. Just like during the days of Valorum, the corporations and bureaucrats ran the galaxy. Palpatine had promised to rid the government of such corruption, yet still it remained, perhaps even worse than ever with the start of the war. The galaxy had suffered for too long, and all that the Chancellor cared about was fear-mongering and warmongering, when in reality, an agreement between the two groups should have been reached. This was not something that Palpatine had foreseen. However, he adapts well, reiterating to the Senate that the galaxy needed a more militaristic presence in order to confront the rapidly growing threat of separatist activity. The Senate is up in arms, and the motion is passed to call for a vote of no confidence, albeit very narrowly. How do these events end up impacting the rest of the story? Let's find out. Despite a significant portion of the Senate supporting Palpatine, there are more senators who are less vocal about their distaste for his actions, as their worlds are suffering greatly due to his war. The no-confidence vote passes by an incredibly narrow margin, leaving the Senate very divided. For the next Chancellor, they elect a voice of reason, and Palpatine's primary opponent in the last race, Senator Organa. While Bail is not as militant as Palpatine, he understands that there is a need for a Republic standing army, so he maintains the clone contract with the Kaminoans. However, he also reaches out to Dooku and proposes finally ending this war for the betterment of both of their societies. Palpatine, after hearing about this, attempts to get Dooku to continue the war, but Dooku, his pride, scoffs at his master. Palpatine had lost all his political authority, whereas Dooku was still an incredibly popular figure in the Confederacy. He uses the dark side as a tool to reach his own ends, not to harm his population like Sidious was planning on doing. He sees the people of Sereno suffering from his higher taxes and lack of presence on their world due to the war. So, Dooku advocates that the Separatist Parliament to continue negotiations to meet a peace treaty with the Republic. This angers Palpatine, who feels betrayed by his apprentice. As a result, he continues to try and manipulate Anakin into joining the dark side. But due to the continued presence of Ahsoka in his life, Anakin has an angel on his shoulder to balance out the devil. Eventually, Anakin feels constricted enough by the Council to say that he wants to leave the Order on his own accord, unable to hide his children from the galaxy any longer. He wants to be more public in his relationship with Padme, and he also wants to have a presence in the lives of his children, something that the Jedi Council would never allow. So, he leaves. Ahsoka tries to get him to stay, but she ends up not being successful. In the end, Ahsoka also decides that in her journey as a Wayseeker, it would be prudent for her to also leave the Order. She had tried to stick things out, but after what happened during the war and how the Council had abandoned her again, Ahsoka just couldn't take any more of their lack of empathy that the Jedi had for the citizens that they claimed to protect. Together, Anakin and Ahsoka leave the Jedi Order, each seeking to forge new paths for themselves in the Force. Anakin raises his children and teaches them the Force while Padme is away dealing with her job in the Senate, whereas Ahsoka continues to help those around her without being restricted by the whims of an out-of-touch religious order. Obi-Wan is saddened by this, but he remains friends with both of them. While it seems that the galaxy is transitioning into a time of peace, especially since Bael's government is beginning to acknowledge more of the rights that clone soldiers have as sentient beings, Palpatine begins to pull the strings once again. He's still a very popular figure within the Republic. Anakin had not joined him, but he knew of another that would gladly take his place by his side in the name of more power. Maul, who would continue to consolidate power in the criminal underworld, could once again become Sidious's apprentice. So, the Dark Lord reaches out to him, asking if once more he would want to rule by his side. Maul, who's thirsty for revenge against the galaxy and the Jedi, agrees, despite everything that Sidious had wronged him with in the past. Sometimes, a common enemy could unite even the worst of adversaries. Palpatine continues to manipulate his connections in the political realm, while Maul works underground, trying to undermine the progress that the Republic was making towards peace. They also say that Dooku, as a traitor to the Sith, would be dealt with. Once again, Palpatine hoped that the galaxy would listen to his voice. Amidst the political commotion of this era, Palpatine would soon return in full glory. Hey folks, I hope that you enjoyed this what-if scenario. If you did, please consider checking out this other video, What If Padme Didn't Fall Out of the Transport? Cheers folks, have a great day, and be sure to get your daily dose of Bantha Stew. It's nutritious and delicious.